Hi, I'm Dr. Mia. Welcome back to the Dr. Mia podcast. I am here today with Dr. Scott Fischer, a forensic psychologist who is going to talk to us a little bit about his work in forensic psychology. Welcome, Dr. Fischer.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
To get started, tell us a little bit about how you got to where you are today. What drew you to forensic psychology?
So it was not my original intention to be a forensic psychologist. I was originally trained as a therapist, and I most of my graduate training and my internship was in doing therapy. And early on in my career, I had the opportunity to do some court-ordered assessments. And I found that I liked it, and I found that it was a match for me. And I can remember the experience that really brought that home for me. I had done an evaluation for family court, and it was kind of a sad case in that the mother of these kids had made a lot of accusations against the dad that weren't accurate, had convinced the kids of a lot of things, including that they had serious physical illnesses. And in the course of my evaluation, this all became clear, and I had to testify in court about that. And I think my testimony was helpful to the judge. And as I was leaving, I encountered the kids in the waiting room. The boy was like about 15 and the sister was about 11. They weren't in the courtroom, but they kind of knew the gist of what I was talking about. I wished them well, and I told them, people are in court trying to help you out today, and you might be upset with me, but I really wish the best for you. And went to shake the kid's hand, and of course he blew me off. And I walked out thinking, knowing that a lot of people would have felt horrible about it, and I didn't. I was comfortable in that role of telling an uncomfortable truth. And that sort of became a theme in my career, and so it really resonated with me emotionally. And then, of course, there's a lot of, intellectual stimulation in forensic psychology, too, that reinforced it. So that's how I got interested, and that's when I started looking for more and more opportunities to do that kind of work.
So just kind of happenstance, you're still kind of training at that point.
Right. I was really early on in my career.
Wow. And most people at that stage of their development professionally would kind of balk at having to go to court and wouldn't have that confidence, or would probably go to the other side of the room to get away from the adolescents who might be directing their anger toward you, and yet you were able to do it with poise.
It was just something that was a lot more comfortable for me than I would have guessed, and it set the stage for a lot of things that I did later in my career.
What then did you have to do to really get the experience and the knowledge to be able to continue to do the majority of your work in this area?
I tried to find people who were smarter than me and knew a lot about it, and get some mentorship.
Yeah. And
it just kind of gradually built some momentum from there.
Sure. And forensic psychology it's not as old as other areas of psychology. And what is the job of a forensic psychologist?
Well, broadly, forensic psychology would be anything that applies the practice of psychology to the law.
Yeah.
So that could be testifying in a criminal case. It could be doing jury consultation. It could be consulting with attorneys, family court, assessing psychological damages. So there's a lot of different things that fall under the rubric of forensic psychology, most of which I don't do or know much about.
Okay.
But my practice is focused more on primarily on family court and criminal court.
So the criminal court piece that you do, what might that look like? What would you be doing as a forensic psychologist there?
There are a few different roles. If you hear about a criminal defendant pleading insanity, somebody has to give the court an opinion about whether they're insane, and that's something a forensic psychologist might do. Related to that, sometimes criminal defendants may be incompetent to stand trial. So if somebody is severely mentally ill or really cognitively limited, it's not fair to continue the criminal case against them. And so a forensic psychologist might do assessments of somebody's competence to stand trial. For certain kinds of offenses, the court might order an evaluation in order to inform sentencing or make some decisions about risk level.
Okay, sure. So if somebody is so ill they don't understand that they're even being charged or what the charges are, that would be kind of the situation where they would be incompetent.
Right. That's
Okay.
exactly right.
Okay. And what does the psychologist do to try and figure out whether or not somebody is competent?
There's a lot of pieces to that. So
Yeah.
obviously you meet them, interview them, get some general information about their history, mental health, substance abuse, but also talk with them about their case and what they understand about their legal circumstances. Who is your attorney? What is your attorney's job? How might your case be resolved? There's a role for psychological testing to get a better sense of their mental health or their cognitive functioning at the time. Record review is a big part of it. So most people who would be referred to assess their competence to stand trial, it's because they've got some history of mental illness.
Okay.
And so reading those records is important. Keeping one eye on the possibility of malingering is important.
Okay. Malingering being...
Faking.
Okay.
Pretending to be more impaired than you really are.
Okay.
And so there are some specialized ways to assess that as far as testing, and some common sense ways to assess that, in terms of, does their appearance match what other people are seeing and what the records are documenting. And so there's a lot of different pieces to doing a competence assessment.
Okay. A lot of it is, just trying to see what matches, what doesn't match, in terms of their presentation, with their history and other reports that you have. And in some cases, if it doesn't add up, then you might think, oh, this person is faking. But in other cases, it might be overwhelming, like this person's really sick and they can't even understand what they're being charged with.
That's correct.
So really important role that the psychologists play then, because in that situation, when a psychologist says someone's incompetent, they essentially aren't even going to be able to face their charges until they're in a better mindset? Or?
Right. Laws vary depending on the states, but
Okay.
in general, if you're not competent and it's a serious charge, so in Minnesota, felony charge, there would be some efforts to restore the person to competence. So they
Okay.
might be committed to a psychiatric hospital, or they might do voluntary treatment.
Okay.
Sometimes if it's a minor charge, they might just dismiss it
Okay.
if it's a misdemeanor charge.
Okay.
And then they'd have a reassessment of their competency at some later date.
Okay. Huh. And so there's competence, and then there's the insanity defense. How are those two things different?
One way they're different is competence has to do with your state of mind right now, your ability today to participate in your defense.
Okay.
The insanity defense has to do with your state of mind at the time that this alleged offense happened. And so the question there is, at the time that this happened, was this person so impaired that they didn't know what they were doing or didn't know that it was wrong?
Okay.
And that's the legal standard here where we are in Minnesota. It is similar in most states, but it can vary some depending on the jurisdiction.
Interesting.
So it's retrospective, and it's a little different. It's a different standard than competence.
Yeah.
Right.
You're not, observing it right now.
Thank God for body cam footage.
Oh, yeah. Talk more about that.
Well, that's a fairly recent thing,
Yeah.
where officers are wearing body cams, and so for somebody doing an evaluation of somebody's an insanity defense, the police get there usually very shortly after whatever happened, and are interacting with the person, and so you can see live footage of what their state of mind was, maybe not at the moment that the alleged offense occurred, but shortly thereafter. So that's a really important tool.
How does alcohol and drugs play into making that decision about whether or not somebody was insane or not at the time of an offense?
Yeah, so I think that's another thing where it depends a little bit on the jurisdiction.
Okay.
Where we are in Minnesota, there's case law that voluntary intoxication is not a defense in most cases. So
Okay.
if I smoke meth and burn your house down because I think you're a witch from the planet Zorkon, even though my state of mind was pretty impaired,
Yeah.
because I chose to smoke meth, and meth can do that to people, then I would not have a defense.
Okay.
There's some exceptions to that we might not, that would be getting pretty far in the weeds,
Okay.
but like we can go a little in the weeds. Like,
Yeah.
for example, if a medication or a drug has an unexpected effect,
Oh.
then it might be a defense. So if all I did was have one hit of weed and then I decided you were a witch from the planet Zorkon and burned your house down, that might be a different case
Okay.
because it was an unexpected, unanticipated effect. But in general, voluntary intoxication won't meet the criteria for an insanity defense.
Okay. Okay. So, and then when you're the forensic psychologist, I assume they have like blood testing or urine testing or something to show whether or not there were substances in their system, or
Hopefully.
Okay.
You know, by the time, as the psychologist, by the time I meet them, it's months and months after this happened.
Yeah.
But it's not unusual that somebody would have been taken to the hospital,
Okay.
and it's not unusual that the hospital would do drug testing, but it's also not a given.
Okay.
So sometimes you're relying on things like, police officers saying they appeared to be intoxicated, or sometimes you can interview other people.
Okay.
So if you, let's say, the person's partner said, yeah, he was smoking meth every day that month, that would be useful information.
Interesting. Okay.
But you're pointing to, an issue with this kind of evaluation in general that you're doing.
Right.
There's no way to go back in time. You just
Yeah.
have to go with the information that you have and sources that may or may not be perfect.
You must have to be really comfortable kind of making decisions based on limited data, right? Like making recommendations to the court,
Well, as comfortable as you can be, and I think you just said something important when you quickly changed your word from decisions to recommendations, because because that's something I think that people would want to know, that it is the judge making the decision.
Yes.
And as a psychologist, here in Minnesota they expect you to give an opinion on a legal issue. Some other places they would say, tell me all about this person, but you don't tell me whether they're insane. I'm the judge. I'll make that determination.
Interesting. Okay.
So you're informing the court, but it really is the court who's making the decision. So I don't have to get all the way uncomfortable.
Are there standards, or are there certain, we're talking about science on our show, and there may, sometimes in certain fields the science isn't there. We don't have, the structure in place to do things in a systematic way that's always going to get us to the right answer. Can you talk a little bit about, is there a process that people are trying to develop or follow?
There's standards of practice. So, there are texts that you can look up about how to do evaluations of competence to stand trial, of criminal responsibility, which is the term for insanity defense. And there's some disagreement on that, but there's lots of agreement on it. So there's practice standards for sure. Some of the underlying methods that we use have science behind them. So psychological testing, we know the reliability and validity of certain tests. It's one step removed because there's no way to directly test if somebody's competent.
Yeah.
But so there's science behind that. And I think the other piece with as far as standards with forensic psychology is there's the law. Competence to stand trial is not whatever I think it is.
Yes.
The law defines it. There's a statute that defines it.
Okay.
And then underneath that, there's cases that further define it. So there's the statute that the legislature passed, but there's also cases that have precedent, like the one that I told you about related to voluntary intoxication.
Okay.
And so when you're doing this kind of work, you're learning psychology, but you're also learning statutes and you're also learning case law, because those are the things that really, those are the standards that you're addressing, and that's the language the courts speak.
Yes. So the laws can help us kind of understand.
Yeah, the law's really, that's really what you're speaking to, and that's the challenges that you're sometimes trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, and that you're trying to apply psychology to the law, and those things, it's sort of an uneasy alliance or connection.
Absolutely. I am going to switch gears again because you told us that you have worked in different courts, and we've been focused on criminal court,
Right.
But I'm also interested in your work in family court. How do forensic psychologists play a role in family courts?
Okay. Well, so family court has to do with child custody and parenting time and those kinds of issues. Forensic psychologists can play a lot of roles. Sometimes the judge will appoint a custody evaluator to meet with both parents, meet with the children, look at records, make some recommendations. Those people are definitely not exclusively psychologists, or at least in our state, not mainly psychologists, but it is a role that psychologists can play. Sometimes the court will order psychological evaluations, either as its own thing or maybe as part of the custody evaluation, and that's something psychologists can do. In Minnesota, it's called a parenting consultant. Some other states use the term parenting coordinator, and that's a role that could be a psychologist or could be another professional, but that's a situation where the parents have enough ongoing disagreements that they can't keep going back to court. There's just not enough judge time to do it, and so they basically have somebody with some mini judicial powers called a parenting consultant who looks into these issues as they come up, and that's a role that psychologists can play. Sometimes psychologists will work not as a neutral for the court, but for one side or another, so they may consult with an attorney about how to best win their case or present their argument. Sometimes psychologists are therapists for people involved and may end up testifying in court or informing the court about the mental status of parents or children.
Okay, so lots of different roles that psychologists can play. You mentioned one role is kind of these mini judicial powers that they might have. I think you said parenting consultant, but some states might differ in terms of what they call that person. Right. And so in that situation, what kinds of decisions might a psychologist be making decisions about?
What school a child would go to is one that comes up pretty often.
Okay.
Sometimes medical decisions. It gets a little tricky depending on the state law, but sometimes the parenting time schedule. If you think about whether you're married or not married to your co-parent, think about anything that you ever might disagree about your child, and they might need to weigh in on any of that.
Wow. Okay. So whenever there's conflict
that can't be resolved otherwise,
then this person would kind of come in and
yeah, I mean, usually the order will constrain the kinds of things that they have authority over.
Okay. What are the advantages for parents who are going through a divorce to, using someone like a parenting consultant rather than the judge to make decisions?
It's probably going to be quicker.
Okay.
You don't have to get a court date. You don't need necessarily an attorney for each decision that's being made.
Mm.
So it might be efficient in that way.
Yeah.
Someone like a parenting consultant can take a little bit more time with each issue than a judge is likely to. So if these things are complicated, they may be able to spend more time looking into it.
Okay, so they really can get into the nuts and bolts of
Hopefully.
what might be happening
Yeah.
and make a better decision for the children.
Hopefully, that's
Yeah.
not it's a role I'm familiar with, but it's not something that I do in my practice now.
Okay, sure. And other things psychologists might do is this evaluator role of parents. What are they looking for? What are, when you've done that work, what kind of things are you looking for in parents and decisions you're making?
A custody evaluation.
Yeah.
The standard is the law. So there's a
Okay.
statute in Minnesota that says these are the factors that judges should be looking at when deciding legal custody and parenting time. And every state has them. They're not the same in every state, but they're pretty similar. They overlap. And I guess the painting with a really broad brush, the parent's ability to meet the needs of the child.
Okay.
And that can be, if it's compromised by mental health or substance abuse, their ability or willingness to cooperate with the other parent.
Okay.
Historically, if you've had a stay-at-home parent that spent most of the time with the children,
Yeah.
that's relevant.
Okay.
To some extent, depending on the age, the children's preferences are relevant. So when I do that, I use testing pretty routinely and also getting information from other sources, whether that's mental health providers for the parents or the children, or I'll look at the children's medical records or school records, or even just people who know the family.
The last thing you mentioned is that there's kind of this consulting role. And I think this is maybe where you spend more of your time now with attorneys.
Sometimes somebody has done a psychological evaluation or they've done a custody evaluation. One side doesn't like it, and the attorney wants another expert to take a look at it.
Yeah.
In some cases, you could do a whole second opinion, but that's a lot of work.
Okay.
That's a thing. I mean, it's definitely done, but it is not that common because it's a lot of time and a lot of money. But sometimes you would just be reviewing the work that another professional did, and there's a bit of an ethical issue there because unless you are doing a do-over,
Yeah.
I don't think in most cases you can really say, well, they got it wrong. I don't agree with their conclusions. But what you can say is their methods are in line with the standards of practice, or their conclusions follow from the information that they had. So you're critiquing the process and
Sure.
being neutral about the outcome unless you've done a second opinion. So that's one role. And
Okay.
then depending on what your opinion is, the attorney may call you to testify in court about that.
Interesting.
Another role would be to be more behind the scenes, to take a look at what the other evaluator did, or to take a look at the whole file and say to the attorney, here are the strengths and here are the weaknesses, what you might be able to say to convince the judge. And sometimes, like for me, sometimes I decide that role after reviewing everything,
Okay.
because the attorney doesn't know what I'm going to think about it. So if I read it and I say this is a mess, I can write a report that really points out all the things this evaluator did wrong. I think would be helpful to you. Great.
Yeah.
But I may read it and say, it's pretty good, really. If I have to write a report to the court, I've got to tell the whole truth, and I'm going to have to tell them it's pretty good. I can probably I've got a few things here that I could write about, but I need to present an objective report to the court. The attorney's going to say, well, I don't want that. That's not helpful. So at that point, I can either go away, or I can not write anything, and I'll help you. But if I testify, I have to be prepared to give the whole picture. But if I'm
Right.
helping you behind the scenes, we can talk about the weaknesses of this and the things that you might be able to ask the expert. So there's a few different roles there.
It seems like you want to make sure that you can be objective. So before you commit to, testifying that a report was done poorly or was done really well, you want to make sure that you've reviewed it and that's something you're going to be able to say. Because I'm sure the attorneys come in wanting you to do and have a certain opinion.
Right. I mean, you don't want to be a hired gun. I mean, there's a lot of ethical issues with that. And honestly, it's probably not a good business practice either, if you have that reputation.
Sure.
And if I write something for court, then it really needs to be objective. Sure, I can point out all the things that they did wrong, but I also need to point out the things that they did right. There's a standard as a witness to provide an objective and balanced opinion, and that may not be helpful in some cases to what the attorney would like to do.
You mentioned before that there were standards in criminal court. Are there standards in family court for how people do their assessments, how they provide an opinion to the court?
There are standards of practice for custody evaluations, for sure. In my opinion, those standards are not as clear as they are in criminal court. And we were talking a little bit about this at lunch before, and we both thought a lot of work in family court, it seems like the Wild West.
Yes.
That people are kind of pulling opinions out of the air.
Yeah.
And I do see that more in that arena than in criminal court. I see more opinions in criminal court that sound like my test data says this and the case law says this, and so therefore my opinion is this, and more opinions in family court that sound like I've been doing this for 35 years and I know what I'm doing and my opinion is this. Not exclusively, and there are standards, but it has at least in where I practice, it has a little bit of a less objective feel to it.
You practice in Minnesota, and one thing that we were also talking about earlier is that Minnesota is pretty unique in that lawyers are allowed to do some of the roles that only psychologists do in certain states. Do you think that contributes to some of the challenges here, or is that something different?
So what you were referring to is that in Minnesota, there are a lot of attorneys doing custody evaluations.
Yes.
I don't know for sure that doesn't happen in any other states.
Okay.
But it doesn't happen much. I'm pretty sure of that. And it's usually mental health professionals doing that. And even, AFCC, which is kind of the most prominent family court multidisciplinary organization, is pretty clear in their guidelines that it should be mental health professionals doing that kind of work.
Okay.
I think, there's some controversy around that because most attorneys don't have formal training in things like child development.
Yes.
I mean, they certainly don't have formal training in psychological testing, and they're not doing that. They would farm that piece out, to be fair.
Sure.
And so it may not be 100% unique, but I don't know of other states where they do that.
Yeah.
And what was your question about that? Something about whether it contributes to the Wild West.
Yes.
Probably. I mean, the other thing that's kind of interesting about family court is it's people from all different kinds of professions.
Okay.
So if you look at who does custody evaluations in Minnesota,
Yes.
I have seen them done by psychologists, social workers, marriage and family therapists, attorneys, guardians ad litem, and at one point, probation officers.
Oh my.
This
okay.
was a long time ago,
Yeah.
but not 80 years ago, 30 years ago, 20, not even 30, 20 years ago.
Okay.
And so I think that contributes to the Wild Westness because not everybody is speaking the same professional language and has the same training and the same assumptions. I hadn't really thought about that before, but that may be a part of it too.
Yeah. Yeah, you're coming at it with completely different training or perspectives.
And at least in Minnesota, there's not really a regulation for doing say, a custody evaluation. And so there are people who are not licensed in any profession doing that.
Wow. Gabby, Gabby's our producer. Gabby, if you want to do custody evaluations tomorrow, I'm not suggesting that. It sounds like you could do that. So, wow.
Pays pretty well.
Don't tell her that. I need her.
And sometimes what I've seen is people will give up their professional license and then continue to do that.
Okay.
So they were trained, and they were licensed. So I guess they're qualified at some level, but there's no recourse if they do a bad job. There's no board that they're accountable to.
Okay.
So I've seen that too.
So kind of that's where the protection of the public with this service might get left behind.
I think so.
Do you think there are certain things that those who are going through a divorce should look for if they're thinking about hiring a psychologist, either to be a consultant again, or if they were looking for an evaluation? What would you suggest to them in terms of what they look for in backgrounds of the people who are doing this?
Oh, I have a few suggestions about that.
Yeah.
Before you even get there is your attorney. In terms of looking for an evaluator, your attorney should be doing most of the legwork.
Oh.
For a few reasons. One is they know the field and they know who's out there. Mm-hmm. But the second is if you call up an evaluator, you're not getting that evaluator.
Okay. Why is that?
Because in order to get an evaluator, both sides have to agree. And if someone is going through a divorce and she calls me and tells me more than 2 sentences about their case, it's over.
Wow.
The other attorney is not going to agree
Wow.
to somebody who's gotten a sneak preview from the other side. I mean, you can call and ask about credentials, probably. Anything more than that, it's probably better to let your attorney handle it, because most people can't help themselves when they're in that situation and they want to tell me about their case.
Okay.
And literally before I can stop them, they've disqualified me.
Wow.
So that's okay. One piece of advice.
So take away, don't be calling psychologists to ask them to work on your case. Let the lawyers do that.
Yeah,
okay.
That would be one recommendation. If you are let's say you are talking to evaluators and you're
Mm-hmm.
just asking about credentials, ask them who they'd recommend. Ask everybody else for 2 more names.
Okay.
And see who keeps coming up.
Yeah.
Would be another way to do it. You can always take a look at people's websites and public persona. You can learn something from that, but if it's not your field, that stuff can be hard to decipher.
Absolutely.
You can look at licensing board decisions, and that's all public, at least in our state. So if somebody has had a licensing board action against them, that might be relevant. I forgot the most basic thing. You definitely want somebody who specializes in that area.
Okay.
The average psychologist is not going to do a good job in family court, and hopefully they know that, but sometimes they don't.
Yeah.
And so you really want somebody who works in that area, primarily or exclusively, or has a lot of experience.
Yeah. So don't go on Psychology Today and
Nope.
and choose someone that way.
Don't
you
do
want to
that.
look to your lawyer and then maybe just ask some of these people who are doing this who they would recommend.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Excellent advice. I know we were talking earlier about raising children, and I have 2 children who are very different from one another. What do people do when they're making decisions for children collectively as a parenting evaluator? And, kids might need different things, right? Mm-hmm. So how does that work?
You don't have to make the same recommendations for all the kids.
Okay.
I think it's pretty unusual, partly because it's impractical, but you could recommend one schedule for one child and another schedule for another child. There's no reason you can't do that. There's no reason a court couldn't order that. But you might have asked something a little different. to the extent that it's hard to do that, how do
Yeah.
you take everything into account is
Right.
maybe a
Right.
part of your question.
Yeah. Well, and if Billy doesn't do well with transitions, but Susan does, right? Like, how do you minimize transitions for one and not the other, and not create a whole lot of chaos for the families in the process,
Right,
right?
and it's actually even more complicated than that, because you're making a decision today that is, unless the parents agree on something else, going to be what they get 5 years from now. And so maybe Billy doesn't do well with transitions now because he's 4, but
Right.
at 9, we don't know.
Yes.
Maybe he's great at transitions at 9,
Yeah.
or maybe not. I don't have a really great answer other than it's something to be aware of and to keep in mind, and you may end up splitting the difference sometimes. I don't really have a great answer, except that you're right to bring it up as an important consideration.
Are there any wins or just moments in your career that really stand out, that really make being a forensic psychologist even more worthwhile for you?
There's just different kinds of worthwhile.
Okay.
We talked about somebody malingering on a competence to stand trial charge, and this happened to me pretty recently, where it was a very serious charge, and the other evaluator, I think, had missed something, and I was able to really, this happened a couple times recently, but the one I'm thinking about they had really missed something, and I was able to identify that and kind of lock it down, and so I felt like justice was done. So that's satisfying in the sense of I got it right. I sort of righted a wrong because the court didn't understand it until I did that. That's satisfying in a way.
Yes.
But it's satisfying in a pretty we got him now way. So
Right.
and that's okay. That's
Yeah.
one level of satisfaction. But another kind of satisfaction is when you feel like you might have actually done some good. In the custody evaluations that we were talking about, the default is you do your whole process, you write recommendations, they go to court, and then either they agree to it or they go to trial and you have to testify, and it goes on and on. But sometimes you can use those recommendations to settle the case, to meet with the attorneys, maybe even meet with the parents. And that's satisfying because the sooner they stop fighting and paying lawyers,
Yes.
the faster everybody can heal and the better for the kids. And you can take the money you were going to pay the lawyers and put it in their college fund.
Yes.
And you can put your swords down and shake hands and try to be nice to each other for the next
Right.
18 years. I was thinking about this the other day, that when those cases settle, I don't think they just settle because I had great ideas. Sometimes they settle because along the way, both these parents feel like you heard them out,
Yes.
you treated them fairly,
Yeah.
you were decent to them and their children, and were working hard at it. Some people are unreasonable, of course, but a lot of people, even who kind of seem unreasonable in the throes of a divorce, are capable of being reasonable.
Yes.
And so sometimes it's satisfying to feel like not only did I do a good job with the recommendations, but I gained some trust with these folks and trust with their attorneys. And maybe even if they don't like everything that I said,
Right.
they're going to take it seriously in a way that will help this to settle.
So many of these divorced families, and we see them in our clinic, as the kids are being treated to help them through the stress of the divorce, and like you said, just being able to have the conflict done, or at least most of it resolved.
Yeah.
And it undoubtedly, as soon as the divorce part is over, we see kids get a lot better, right?
Hopefully. Yes.
If the fighting slows down or ceases, and so we really see that clinically on our end, and to know that you play a major role in just helping the two different sides just kind of find a common ground that they can live with, and allow these families to work toward that new future for all of them, right? A different future than maybe some of them thought, but a good future nonetheless, that that they can work toward.
I got one more if you want.
Yes, I do. I love these stories.
Sympathy for the devil category. In Minnesota, like in many states, people who commit an offense of a sexual nature after they finish prison, they get committed. And some of these people have done some really bad stuff, and they get committed for a really, really long time. And I'm on a committee that is tasked with assigning the risk level for these folks when they get out, because they have to register. And these are people who nobody likes. I've found that when you actually hear their whole story and realize they've been in treatment for 30 years, having to log every fantasy and, having to really drill down and figure out what went sideways, they've actually worked really hard to get to the point of being released from commitment. To be a part of that, of somebody actually getting out and getting some degree of redemption and getting back in the community, even though they might be 75 and they've been in prison and then in treatment till for 40 years or something. There's something rewarding about that, that they have some opportunity to still have some quality of life and do something decent for other people when they get out. And to play a small role in that is satisfying too, and it reminds you of humanity of folks that a lot of people would want to deny.
I mean, that must be such emotional work, right? To work with offenders who have done some horrific things, but then, to be able to believe in change, right? And psychologists, that's kind of what we do, is we believe that people are capable of change, and especially clinical psychologists. If they couldn't change, we'd be out of a job.
I think, right, I think psychologists believe that, and probably even most people in our society would profess that belief. But, the experience that I've had with people in that situation is it's a good test of faith of that belief. Okay, man, you say anybody, there's hope for everybody. Let's see you put your money where your mouth is, and can you really get behind this person?
Yeah. And I can imagine, I've had these thoughts myself as a psychologist, okay, I believe in this, but gosh, if this happened to a family member of mine, could I actually believe that the perpetrator is capable of change? And just so much complexity with all of it.
And I think that's part of the challenge and the reward of doing this kind of work is to stretch yourself, to put some of those prejudices, those emotions, put some of your knee-jerk reactions aside and try to add something of value to the situation. If people are listening to this because you're involved in the court system and you're involved with forensic psychologists or evaluators, whether it's in criminal or family court, whether it seems like it or not, most of the professionals working in your case are quite well-intentioned and maybe more on your side than it appears. If you try to keep that in mind, you have a better chance of having a good outcome with your situation. And for people who aren't involved in the system, appreciate your listening to us this time. I hope that you stay curious about forensic psychology specifically and psychology in general, and watch me next time and the time after that. And it sounds like you're booked out for a number of Fridays.
Yeah. Well, thank you again, Dr. Fischer. I just can't express my appreciation enough. You have such an incredible career and experience, and we've known each other for a long time, and I just marvel at the work that you do. Dr. Fischer is with Acumen Psychology, a very reputable forensic psychology clinic that's been around for a while. So we thank you, Dr. Fischer. Thanks for watching. And make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Have a good week.